Welcome back. You're watching episode 3 of the Qatar Files right here on NewsX. Today we expose Qatar's propaganda machines that are operating at a much larger and more sophisticated level than people could have imagined. A country that is regionally alienated and faces stiff opposition from the Saudi-led bloc for supporting and funding terrorism now uses its unlimited wealth to shape foreign opinion and buy allies through soft influence. How does Qatar use its media networks and other means to buy support from the West and get away with its terror funding? To break this down, we have with us David Reboy, author of Qatar's Shadow War. David, appreciate you taking out the time and speaking with us. It's a very important discussion that we have at hand. The first question that comes to my mind is, can you tell us about your book, Qatar's Shadow War, in detail?
So I wrote my book, Qatar's Shadow War, about the efforts by the tiny Gulf Islamist emirate to influence U.S. policy, specifically through media, think tanks, and the like. It's a case study in the infrastructure of influence in the United States. So I wrote my book, Qatar's Shadow War, about the efforts by...
Right. David, you claim that Qatar successfully built an influence operation network in America. What is this network all about and how does this operate? Tell us.
Well, the influence network that Qatar built over the course really of decades, but specifically in the last couple of years, involves creating a media environment and a kind of a government media complex, government media think tank complex environment where everyone is saying the same things, and the sort of the Qatari position is taken uncritically, and Qatar's enemies are relentlessly attacked. And its kind of nefarious agenda is mocked or brushed under the carpet, and we see the latest example with the case of retired 4-star General John Allen, who used to work in Qatar, and when he used to head U.S. Central Command based out of Qatar. And then he went to work for Brookings, which is the recipient of tens of millions in Qatari money. It turns out that he was taking money and working directly for the Qataris to advance their interests in Washington, D.C. as an unregistered lobbyist, which is illegal. The latest news on that is he was kind of pushed out of Brookings. He was forced to resign. But I don't think in this case necessarily that the system worked. The system was supposed to catch people like this, when in fact it turns out that it looks like it was a whistleblower who saw that the statute of limitations on this is going to expire, and just put it out there so as there'll be a record for this. Because Allen, it turns out, was the only one involved in this scheme who never faced legal scrutiny, sort of until now. And to this day, the U.S. Department of Justice has not taken action on him.
Right, that's incredible information, David. And also tell us about who are the primary targets of the Qatari influence in the United States.
Qatar's enemies in the region would be Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. With a small asterisk including Egypt as well. So really, it was in the summer of 2017, many of Qatar's neighbors got together and decided that they'd had enough of Qatar's efforts to try to undermine them and topple their regimes. Al Jazeera was a primary, Al Jazeera was a primary motivating force. It was a primary engine of what we call in the West the Arab Spring, and that was really Al Jazeera being used as an instrument of the Qatari government to foment revolutions throughout the region. And of course, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt.
David, also tell us, what role does Qatari state media, specifically Al Jazeera, play in its information warfare today?
Sure. Al Jazeera plays a big part in Qatar's information warfare strategy. It may even play the biggest part. It is, on its own, it is one of the largest media networks in the world. It's being seen by tens, if not hundreds of millions of people throughout the Arab-speaking world. That's not to mention its efforts in the United States and elsewhere throughout Europe, throughout Asia, being broadcast in English. And it really, what it was able to do was, it was all around the world, not only, so for example, Al Jazeera coverage in English influenced the US government in 2011 to oppose its longtime ally, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. In the same year, a few months later, Al Jazeera coverage convinced the US government and the English government to intervene in Libya. It's case after case. People watch what they see on Al Jazeera, real news, and they respond to it. And this is just how it's been. And it's a tremendous tool for the Qataris to use to create the reality that they want to create. And then that reality creates and urges different actions on the parts of world leaders and business leaders and things like that.
David, let's also talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. What is it, and how does the Qatari state help the Brotherhood in spreading its ideology?
The Muslim Brotherhood is the largest modern Islamist movement in the world. It was founded in 1928 in Egypt, and since then it has really moved all around the world into just about every country, and especially in the West. And the Qatari state sort of made a deal for legitimacy with the Muslim Brotherhood many decades ago, and it became, through its massive natural gas wealth, the largest patron of the Brotherhood globally. And we see kind of one hand washing the other. We see the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood in different states, especially in the West, advancing the interests of Qatar. And then we also see Qatar advancing the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood in the same places. Specifically when it comes to the war on Saudi Arabia, the war on India, the war on the Emirates, or Israel, or the Egyptian government, etc. We see these two things going hand in hand. And this really goes back to the 1960s, when the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out of Egypt and needed a place to go. Many of the leadership went to Europe, and many of the leadership actually went to places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And to this day, they were evicted. They've been evicted from most places in the Middle East. The Saudis did a good job with it. The Emiratis did a good job with it, as did the Egyptians. But really, Qatar is where they've been able to run free. The chief jurist of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, is probably the most famous person living in Qatar. He had a big show on Al Jazeera for many years, and called Sharia and Life. And he is an honored guest of the Qatari regime. You cannot really separate the Brotherhood and Qatar.
David, those are good points. Also tell us, how elaborate and dangerous is Qatar's information warfare mechanism, and how do we counter it?
Qatar's information and influence operations are elaborate and dangerous, but it's very difficult to counter in a free society. And obviously, from one country to the next, the solutions will be varied. and really based on the acuteness of the problem. I mean, in the United States, there's a couple things that we can do right away. We won't do them, but we should be doing them. For example, top number one would be to make sure that Al Jazeera actually does register as a foreign influence operation. This has been on the books for a number of years now, but they just haven't done it. And there's nobody forcing them to do it. The Department of Justice is not on their case to do it. They just decided we're not going to do it, and that's good enough for the Justice Department. Number two would be to finally move U.S. Central Command out of Qatar. I mean, this is one of the huge vulnerabilities that the United States has in terms of influence. We also have a similar situation in Turkey. We have these massive bases, these forward operating bases in different places in the world. And I'm not saying they're not needed. I'm not saying they're not required. But every time we do this, we are a guest of the host nation. The host nation really loves to have us there because it gets to exert influence over U.S. decision making, specifically the military's decision making, which is quite pernicious. We saw this with General Allen. You know, once you go and you go through the expense of creating a massive city with an unbelievable amount of logistics and military hardware and money and people all pushed into a place. You've built this thing. Well, now you've built this thing and you can't really move it easily. And the priority becomes, how do we safeguard this thing? And that's the situation we're in when it comes to Qatar and the airbase. And as a matter of fact, one of the emails from General Allen shows that he was instructing the Qataris to put leverage on the United States over using the airbase. So this is a vulnerability that everyone understands and everyone knows about. And I mean, I would, if I had my way, I would move that airbase to a place like the United Arab Emirates, where we have much better relations, where there's a much better government policy there when it comes to Islamists, and it's a much easier it's much easier in terms of our foreign policy goals. So that's what I would do. Those are the two things that I would do. The third thing is I would declare the Muslim Brotherhood a foreign terrorist organization, which the UAE did in, I think, 2011, quite rightly. Many other governments have done the same. I'm not sure if India today still considers the Brotherhood a terror organization, but it really should, because it is a key part, if not the key part, of that Islamist infrastructure.
Right, absolutely, David. And also, recent research into transaction of Qatar's state-run Eid charity has proven that they have links with the Muslim Brotherhood regimes, the Hamas, and even offshoots of the Al-Qaeda. Why is the world silent on Qatar's role in funding terrorism for so long?
Well, I think it's what we've been discussing. The reason for that is what we've been discussing this whole time, which is just that the Qatari network of influence is very strong, and that goes from influencing media and think tanks and government, all the way to just buying people. I mean, we saw with General Allen. The scope of this is pretty ridiculous and massive if you think about it. This is the highest ranking general, the guy who ran the Afghanistan war, the guy who ran the Iraq war for a time for the US government, and is at the head of, or was at the head of, America's largest and most influential think tank, non-governmental organization. I mean, this guy is a big deal. And he was absolutely in the pocket of the Qatari government, and he was scoring wins all over the place just because he's got his relationships. Someone in that position knows everybody, can walk into any office in Washington D.C. and at least get a fair hearing. And this is, I mean, it's a tremendous problem, and I'm just glad that whoever at the FBI decided that the American people needed to know this. I think that person is a kind of hero, because the U.S. government would very much like to bury this story. Especially the Biden administration would love to bury this story.
David, appreciate you taking out the time and speaking with us and giving us those insightful details about this very important conversation. We have with us Clifford Smith, Director of the Washington Project at the Middle East Forum. Clifford, appreciate you joining us and talking to us. This is a very important conversation. The first question is, you have called the Al Jazeera Qatar's propaganda media conglomerate. Why do you say so?
Really hidden. I mean, it's not really shy. If you look at their corporate filings, for example, in the UK, which are very public, it was owned entirely by the Emir of Qatar up until a couple of years ago. And then a couple of years ago, when people started asking questions about Al Jazeera and who it was, what it was up to, they basically shuffled those around. Again, you can see this in filing documents in the UK that are public, that it was transferred then to a shell corporation that was run by one of his family members. So it went from literally the Emir of Qatar owning the entire station to it being run by a company that is run by one of his relatives. And this is public, if you look at the UK filing documents. And what's more, Qatari law, recently passed actually, forbids essentially criticizing the regime whenever it might harm their national security, which is, of course, vague and unspecific, and functionally allows them to censor anything they don't like. And when you look at the positions Al Jazeera takes, particularly in the Middle East, but not exclusively, there are other branches around the world, they always, or almost always anyway, certainly in any significant matters, take the side of the Qatari government. And they are used as a tool for Qatar to influence other countries and influence politics in their direction. Saudi Arabia, for many years, threw around a lot of money to support radical Islamic causes, to sort of bend Arabia in its direction. And while it still has influences, it doesn't quite do the same thing that Qatar does anymore. They don't fund radicals in the same way. They don't spread propaganda in quite the same way, not as aggressively. It's a very different situation. In many ways, Qatar, with Al Jazeera, has become sort of the main purveyor of radical Islam in the Middle East.
Clifford, also tell us, how has Qatar's state-owned Al Jazeera managed to flout American laws for foreign-owned media outlets? That's strange.
That's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. There have been multiple efforts to call attention to the obvious, that Qatar is a state-run organization that, supports the state's interests above all, that they were, owned by the emir, so on and so forth. Congress has sent many letters. There have been language and bills. There has been multiple things to try to have Qatar be more transparent. And late in the Trump administration, very late, like within a month or two before the election, the Department of Justice formally demanded that Al Jazeera register under those laws. However, after that, simply nothing happened. And you have to think that there's some politics going on behind the scenes, that for whatever reason, the Biden administration doesn't think it's worth or it's a good idea to enforce the DOJ order that was put out by the previous administration. I have worked to get answers about this. I've been asking questions. I've been getting members of Congress to ask questions, but so far, nothing has happened. And it's really been striking. Essentially, is what Qatar has done, is essentially dare anybody to enforce the order. They have openly said this shouldn't apply to us. We're evaluating legal options. And they played politics, is my take. They have gotten everybody they can to push in the other direction, just openly defy the law and hope that nobody's actually going to enforce it. It does help that the law has, I'm not sure if loopholes is the right word, but enforcing it is not as easy as it should be. There should be easier enforcement mechanisms. Frankly, other than Al Jazeera, no other foreign propaganda arm, whether it be Chinese or Russian or Turkish or any others, have actually fought it the way Al Jazeera has. Many others have just complied. Al Jazeera has not, and basically have used politics as a cudgel to try to stop it. And so far, they've been successful. Whether or not that will continue is anybody's guess.
All right, absolutely. Also tell us, how does Al Jazeera work to influence opinion in favor of Qatar in America as well as Europe?
I mean, it's fairly simple, is what you might expect. Anybody that agrees with the Qatari government has given much more favorable coverage. Anybody that doesn't is not. Radical Islamists are generally given favorable coverage, or at least their foes are painted badly. Anything bad that happens to any group that Al Jazeera likes is painted as Islamophobia, or is painted as some other kind of nefarious plot. And what's more, particularly in the context of India, I mean, Al Jazeera has, and as well as some other Pakistani media arms, such as Middle East Eye, Qatari Middle East media arms, such as Middle East Eye, have pretty openly championed the cause of Kashmir, for example, in ways that many other more objective sources, even ones that are not necessarily super friendly to India, have not. I mean, it reads like propaganda. It's not like a biased news story. It's essentially, oh, isn't this terrible, all this stuff that's happening, completely one-sided, completely lacking context, sometimes simply, I would argue, made up in certain situations. It varies. There are people in Al Jazeera that do decent reporting on some issues. The problem is, at the end of the day, all of it is the institution is functionally going in one direction and to achieve one goal, and that is to help the aims of the Qatari government.
Clifford, also talk about what are some of the other methods through which Qatar pushes itself and its propaganda in the US.
Anyways, one way, as you have already pointed out, is Al Jazeera. They have online platforms that they push pretty aggressively in the United States. Another big way, and I think probably the most underappreciated way, is through America's education system. Qatar is, let me take a step back. Foreign money being pumped into American universities has been recognized by Congress as a problem. They did a very large report a couple of years ago on the Chinese influence in American universities. Basically, they had given money and sent scholars, so-called in some situations, to the U.S. to ostensibly support, Chinese language learning or history or whatever, but that Congress thought was really serving the interests of the Chinese government. Qatar is actually a bigger donor in terms of pure dollars than China is. It is the biggest donor, to the degree you believe the public reporting, which actually is somewhat incomplete, even though it's legally required. Congress and the last administration found that the kind of dollars flowing in American universities was not always reported in the way it was supposed to after some probes. But to the degree you believe those numbers, Qatar is number one in terms of how much money they're putting into U.S. universities. And there's a striking lack of transparency even at that, because while the law requires them to report this money, as I also said, it's not always enforced. But beyond that, it's not required that they report what they are spending it on. So, for example, if they are spending money on hydraulic fracking or energy exploration, or changing natural gas into make it storage facility, something like that, which things Qatar might have an interest in and which American engineering universities might have an interest in, that is not a problem. Nobody seriously is concerned about that. If they're doing it to promote Middle East studies or international affairs or things like that, which I think is definitely true in some cases and probably true in most, that's much more of a concern. That's propaganda at the end of the day. And we don't know how much is going to that, but it's a lot. We know that. We also know that they've had partnerships with various American universities that include, back to Al Jazeera, American universities partnering with Qatari universities that then have partnerships with Al Jazeera. I mean, there's openly like pages about, oh look, we have this partnership with Al Jazeera. Come here and learn with Al Jazeera experts. So it really is a sophisticated operation, and that's just on the university front. There's more even beyond Al Jazeera universities. They hire lobbyists. They're aggressive in their courting of congressional staff. I have talked to congressional staff personally that bribery is a strong word. They would not try to bribe them, but they did try to, oh, come to this fancy concert. The embassy's putting on a fancy concert, things like that. It's really one of the more aggressive lobbying efforts in the country from a foreign government, I would say, by quite a bit.
Right. Do you think that Qatar was successful in getting the U.S. to broker lifting off the diplomatic blockade by the Saudi bloc through soft power influence it has created in the United States?
I would put it slightly differently. It depends on how you look at it. What I would say is that Qatar successfully got the U.S. to more or less stay neutral and to a degree lean on the other Gulf states to end the blockade. I don't think they were aggressive at getting the U.S. to broker it per se. I do think they basically got the U.S. to say, hey, do we really need to do this? This is causing us problems. And to basically create a stalemate, which one is eventually, from the point of view of Saudi, UAE, so on and so forth, was not in their best interest to continue. And the U.S.'s sort of tacit approval of them pushing back and sort of creating this stalemate helped Qatar achieve its goals and functionally not changing anything. They still support radical theocrats, be it the Muslim Brotherhood or Salafi, imams, such and such. They still support terrorist groups and host them there. They still funnel money to Hamas, among others, and that has not changed. And the fact that hasn't changed, even when there was significant pressure on them to do so, is a victory in a way.
All right. Well, recent research into Qatar's state-run Eid charity has exposed funding for Muslim Brotherhood regimes, Hamas, and even offshoots of Al-Qaeda. How is Qatar getting away with the covert terror funding, and for how long will it get away?
Again, I think it's politics. I mean, some of my colleagues, Sam, Jordan, Apanev, some other people that have worked with Middle East Forum on this issue have detailed, in written in great detail, I should say, about what the Eid charity has funded. Some of it is hidden, for lack of a better word. In the sense that, some of it, number one, this was documents that we came in contact with that were not intentionally made public. But even beyond that, some of these organizations, it's not obvious. You have to look into it a little bit to figure out who they are and what they're doing and what they're preaching. And some are a little bit more overt, but it's a mix. And that creates some ambiguity, which makes it harder. And frankly, again, I think national interests change. Ideologies remain much longer. And while I have many differences with the Saudi government, with some of the UAE's government, and many others, the Saudis were for many years sort of the main financier, the main backer of radical Islamist ideologies, be it the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi movements, other radical movements in the Middle East and abroad. And yet they have stopped. However, that ideology still holds some sway with some people in Arabia, in Europe, in North Africa, in South Asia. And so there was people looking for partnerships, and Qatar kind of picked that up. But the thing is, the world had spent years looking the other direction, as they continue to do today with Qatar and with Iran, for whatever pragmatic reasons, for finance, for politics, whatever the case may be. So basically, they have picked up that issue, and they've taken it on themselves when the world has gotten too used to looking the other way and not really demanding change. And the demand is still out there among enough people to where they can get away with it.
Right. Also, Clifford, talk about what is the extent of on-ground radicalization that Qatar has achieved through its various propaganda tools, both online and offline.
I think it's a myriad of ways. Qatar does not have a large army. It does not have a large landmass. It does not have. It does not host Mecca. It is not the birthplace of Shiaism. It does not have some of the tools that Iran, Saudi Arabia, some of the other bigger countries, more established, bigger militaries, bigger landmass, bigger, longer history have. They don't have that. What they do have is a great deal of money. They have natural gas, and they have a very small amount of people that are actually citizens, and so they have a great deal of money. So they can basically use that money to push their ideology almost any way as a tool of their foreign policy, be it funding radical imams, funding terrorist groups, funding ideological extremist groups, funding networks of different sorts, websites, lobbying efforts. It is the tool of their foreign policy, essentially. At the end of the day, being able to manipulate their adversaries or even their friends, as the U.S. Is, sadly, in my view, on some level, into doing what they want. And that is the goal of much of this, and it will likely continue until it is forced to stop.
Clifford, last question. Does the Qatar example prove the importance of soft power and media influence, which is often taken lightly by other nations? How do we counter Qatar's propaganda?
It's not an easy problem. There's no where media is cheaper, more diverse. People can read things from any country, any place, much more easy. You can promote things on social media much more easily. If you value things like freedom of speech, which I do, there's a very difficult nexus here between what you allow for free speech. I think at the end of the day, the main tool is transparency, to make sure that everybody knows who they're hearing from and what they're selling. That is what makes Al Jazeera's, for example, fight to stay in the dark in terms of what they're really up to, what they're really doing, so interesting. I mean, RT, the Russian television station in the U.S., it exists. I think it creates some problems. Nobody really takes it seriously. Everybody understands. I mean, it is registered as a foreign agent. And very few take it seriously. They essentially know it's a propaganda arm of the Russian government. Al Jazeera managed to make a name for itself in a way that RT didn't. So before this all started. So now more people take them seriously and see them as the voice of the Muslim world or what have you. When it isn't true. It is a voice of some Muslims and some people from the Gulf and so on and so forth, but there are many others, and many of the others are diametrically opposed in many different ways. So I think that transparency is important. I think pushing for that transparency is important. And be that government, forcing them to open up their finances before broadcasting into their countries, whether it be even just enterprising nonprofits or news organizations, whatever the case may be, loudly pointing out what Qatar is doing, that helps too. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of tools to push back, but it's a sticky problem, I'm not gonna lie to you. So long as information is easily transmitted, different, people, both good and bad, in many cases bad, are going to use the openness of the free flow of information to push, disinformation and information that is favorable only to them. And we're gonna have to deal with that problem for a long time.
Right. Clifford, appreciate you joining us and for that incisive information that you have given us as well as our viewers.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.